neat. I'm glad she's doing well. I really am.
You know, we was coming through Homeville the other day. I said, oh, I better slow down, look. And that said, she wished Chelsea would pull me over.
She's the only one that's got the red lettering on the back doors.
She might pull you over. She might do that very thing.
I know.
And give him a ticket.
Yeah.
I would take it.
If you have a Bible and you like following along, please turn it to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. This is where we're going to spend our time. Paul says in this very text we're going to look at today that the gospel is foolishness to the Greek mind. Now, for those of us sitting in this room, or most people today, that really doesn't have a lot of meaning. But it should, because actually everybody in this room and everybody in this country practically, or generationally, and in all of Europe, essentially have Greek minds. That's how we think. All of our philosophical categories come from Greece, and we are, every one of us in this room, what would be called an Aristotelian thinker. Whether we know it or not, we are. Everybody. We think in terms of a premise and evidence and a conclusion that we draw, and that's how we think. And there are two deep impediments. Paul says of the Greek mind that for them the gospel is foolishness, and it's foolishness to most of our minds as well for two very specific reasons. One is, it's too simple. It's just too simple. Our Greek minds want something more complicated that we have to think through. Something that we have something to do with in thinking about the gospel. Just the idea of just asking God for mercy and accepting something doesn't fit in our mindsets. And if you think that's not true, I'm going to say it's because you've been a believer long enough that you're no longer affected by it. But trust me, I talk to a lot of non-believers every day. This is exactly how they look at the gospel. The second part of the gospel that fights our Greek minds is it's gross. It's gross. Think for a moment. Just put yourself in this mindset. What would it mean to you if somebody robbed a store? Not even at gunpoint. They just shoplifted. And the municipality took them and put a cross up in the middle of town and nailed them to it and left them there to die. We would be horrified. There's a reason why the gospel is hard for people, and these are two of them. So let's take a look at this text. What we're going to be studying today is what's known in theological terms as soteriology. That term comes from the Greek word that is used in the Bible for salvation. So let's take a look at it as we become experts on soteriology. Paul says in verse 18 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the message of the gospel, the cross, is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to those of us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it's written, I'll destroy the wisdom of the wise, I will thwart the cleverness of the intelligent. Where's the wise person? Where's the expert in the Mosaic law? Where is the debater in this age? Has God not made the wisdom of this world foolish? Since in the wisdom of God, the world by its wisdom did not know God, God was pleased to save those who believe by the foolishness of the preaching. For the Jews demand miraculous signs and Greeks ask for wisdom, but we preach about a crucified Christ, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. The weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Think about the circumstances of your call, brothers and sisters. Not many were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were born to a privileged position. But God chose what the world thinks foolish to shame the wise, and God chose what the world thinks weak to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, what is regarded as nothing, to set aside that which is regarded as something, so that no one can boast in God's presence. He is the reason you have a relationship with Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness, sanctification, redemption, so that it's written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Now there's a lot in this text, and I can't go into all of it. There are probably a dozen sermons out of this one text. But what we're looking at here is the fact that the gospel strikes our minds in certain ways. And the first way it strikes us is it's just too darn simple. And people resist it because of that. And I'll tell you how the resistance goes. Here's the question. People will say, and they've said it to me, I can't count the number of times I've been asked this question. Look, if God's all powerful and He's all loving, why didn't He just save us? Why didn't He just let us off the hook? He could do that. He could just say, I'm just canceling the debt, don't worry about it. He could do that. Why doesn't He? Well, there's a good reason for that. If He did so, He would not be what is known as a perfected being. He could not be the supreme being. Because what He'd be doing is He'd be setting justice aside in the universe. Justice would mean nothing. If God sets justice aside in that way, He's no longer the supreme being. Because if He's the supreme being, He has to be supremely just. He has to be. What's going on here? Okay. So He can't just let us off the hook without making a mockery of justice. God's method of salvation has to be utterly complete, or it's not God's method of salvation. There's no in between. They're available. So God's method of salvation has to be not only effective, but it has to meet deep human needs. In other words, it has to be utterly effective. So why isn't it in some cases? Why do people look at the salvation that God provides and say, it's not working for me. I don't see the point here. Why does God have to do it this way? The problem is, inside of every human being, we ourselves are fragmented people. We are not whole. And part of that fragmentation is that there's a friction between what we perceive ourselves to be and what we really are. Now, it seems to me that if we want to solve that problem, there's only one way we can do that. We could ask a lot of people, I guess, and let them comment about who they think we are. Or we could find out who the supreme being, the maker of the universe, says that we are. And in finding that out, we could actually know something about having this fragmentation removed from us. Well, let's stop and think about that for just a minute. We live in a country where the ethos of our country is one of the things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can't pursue happiness. It's impossible to pursue happiness. What is happiness? What has to be pursued, if we're going to pursue happiness, is something that makes us happy. In other words, there's got to be something we do, something we go for, something we try to achieve, and in that work toward the achievement, we find the satisfaction in it that makes us happy. That's the only way happiness is found. Jesus knew this. Jesus said it well. Look at the Sermon on the Mount sometime and read it. What does He say? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemaker. Do you know what that word blessed is? Markurioi. You know what markurioi means? Happy.
Huh.
Happy. There are modern translations where they get that right. That's what it means. Happy are the meek. Happy are the peacemakers. Happy are the poor in spirit. And he goes on and he lists all these things which are activities that we would engage to live a certain way that will make us happy. You can't pursue happiness just as happiness. Let me figure out what happiness is and go after that. It's impossible. And so we're told too, as we thought about in the prayer time today, it occurred to me, we're called more than conquerors in this world. Happy, we're to be happy. Here's the way you go for happiness. You pursue these things that bring that satisfaction. But we're also said to be more than conquerors. What does that even mean? Well, the only way we can find that out is to say, okay, how are we? What are we before God? The Bible tells us that God wanted us. He just wanted to make us. And that tells me something about God. Did He make us because of some deficiency He has? He's lonely. Universe is a big place. Maybe God wanted some company. No. It's just because He wanted to give us life as sentient creatures. He is pure giving. He needs nothing. So we know that we're given life. God wanted us. That tells us something about ourselves. It also tells us things about us, the Bible does, and says we're made in His image. What is that? Does that mean that God is with hands and feet and hair and nose and eyes and all. No. God has no image. Why do you think the Jews have no image for God anywhere? God said, don't make an image. I'm imageless. Do not make an image. So what about us as in the image of God? Well, a couple of things. One is we're free. We can choose. I can lift this pen up. I could drop it and it would fall. I mean, I'm free to make choices about my body. I have causal power in the universe. That's one thing. God has causal power. I mean, He made the whole place. The second thing is I'm sentient. I know stuff. I know that Ed's looking at me. I know that the sun is shining. I know that this computer has just lost its mouse and I can't use the mouse anymore. I know things, that are working. I have recognition, so I'm sentient. The Bible tells us other things about how God views us. He says that He chose us and redeemed us because He loves us. So if those things are all true, guess what happens to you and me? In terms of being more than a conqueror and in terms of being happy, we all get set free from any comparisons that we would have one to the other. I can't compare myself with Brad. I mean, I could, but there's no point in it because around the cross, the ground is utterly level for all of humanity. No matter who comes, when we come before God, the ground is perfectly level. Nobody sticks up except Jesus Himself. Nobody stands apart. You take even the Apostle Paul, great man that he was. He's no different than KG when it comes to how God sees us. So the comparisons evaporate. And what that does for us, if we can capture it, is it gives us a sense of self-worth that carries us through every circumstance, no matter what. We're more than conquerors. Think about it in what Jesus said. What did He say? He said, look, guys, if you want to say Jesus would say that to us, look, guys, they can kill the body, but after they've killed the body, they've done all they can do. There's nothing else they can do. Why? Because I've conquered death, and so will you. So there's a sense in which there's an internal change that we can have if we want it, just because of who Jesus is and what He's done. And just because God says who we are to Him, we can find a way to eliminate the externals and come to a place of internal gravity and peace that can't be taken away from us no matter what, because of what God says we are. Now, all of this comes to us through faith. And we don't use the word faith properly at all. Faith is not just an empty thing of saying, I believe it, therefore it is. That is not faith. That's not biblical faith. I see componentry in faith that has to do with who we are as thinking beings. I see three components. Now, you could probably think of more, but I've only got three, so we'll go with that. The first is understanding, the second is conviction, and the last one is commitment. Now, let's think about those for just a moment. And I'm going to say if those three things are not present, we're not talking about biblical faith. First of all, we have to understand it. Paul said that right here in this text we read. He said, by the foolishness of preaching, the gospel comes. So we're given propositions about who Jesus is, about who we are, about who God is, and we take those into our minds and we think about them. We understand them. Secondly, we have the sense of conviction. God tells us who we are before Him, and it changes our perspective on the way in which we think about ourselves relating to God. There's a gap between us and God that somebody's got to bridge for us. And then finally, the commitment. We understand it, we see the conviction, and then we're willing, on the basis of the evidence we have in the thinking process, to say, I've got enough evidence here to make a commitment to this. I'll belong to Jesus. I will be a follower of Jesus. Now, if we don't have any content to faith, there's no thinking or understanding, then there's no content to it at all. It becomes faith in faith. I remember a few weeks back, and I won't say where, because some of you may have passed it as well. If you did, that's okay. A church sign. I'm driving by. I don't like these church signs. I like ours okay, but we don't go out there and change some message on it every day to say something that the whole world needs to see. This one says, don't think, just believe. That's what it said. I thought to myself, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't just believe. Because that means you and I can believe anything. That is the operating model that people who don't believe think of you and me. That's what the world thinks of the believer in this country today. I read a Washington Post quip in an article where the writer said this, and speaking specifically of those of us who are in the South who are believers, you know, the guns, Bible, and all that kind of thing. And this is what it said. It said they are poor, uneducated, and easily led. Now, I reject that perception, but when I see a church sign that says, don't think, just believe, maybe these people who are writing these disparaging articles are onto something. I mean, I don't want to think about myself like that. And then we'll see a response to it from some of us who do think a little bit. We'll say something like this, but I can still have faith and think. That's still the wrong way to look at it. Because you're still saying that there's something superior here. Faith, if it's biblical faith, will stimulate the very best of thinking, the very best of rationality that we have to offer ourselves and to others. Norman Cousins said this of us, and you may not know who that writer is, very famous social commentator, and he said this, and I think he's right. Ours is not the age of the meditative, that is the thinking. Ours is the age of the sprinting, shoving age. Daily, he said, new antidotes for contemplation spring into being and leap off the store shelves into our homes. And I think he's exactly right. That we just surround ourselves with things that insulate us from thinking. You know, think about this for a moment. What would you think would be the very best tool if you wanted to destroy the gospel that Satan could possibly give us as a tool to destroy the gospel? If you wanted to destroy the gospel, the best tool you could give humanity would be to rob them of the ability to think. Mm-hmm. Surround us with stuff that keeps us entertained and keeps us happy in a superficial sense and keeps us from thinking. That would be the very best way if you wanted to eliminate the gospel. People who lose their faith, and I encounter a bunch of them who say, I was once a believer and I lost my faith. And they say, well, I came to the place where I thought about it this way and that caused me to reject the gospel. I'm going to say, it didn't come from thinking too little. It came from not from thinking too much, but from thinking too little. Because I've been a believer now for 39 years. And to this very day, I think about the gospel, what it means. I think about theology. I think about salvation. I think about all these things every day. And I'm more convinced than I ever was a week ago that all this is true. A person who loses their faith is doubting dangerously because they've not thought about it well enough. There's nothing wrong with doubting. Everybody doubts. But if we think about it really well, those doubts will be taken care of. Immanuel Kant, you may not know who that is, some do. Great Enlightenment era philosopher who was a believer. And he said this, there are 3 questions that every human being has to wrestle with in living a life wherein we truly think about our life. He said the first one is, how can I know what's real? That's a good question. The second is, he said, how can I know what I must do to do what is right? That's a very good question. The third one is, he said, what can I hope for and what can I live for? Our culture tells us to leave those kinds of questions to the professional philosopher. Those are the people who are supposed to think about stuff like that, the eggheads. I don't think the Bible says that. The Bible tells me something about faith that makes me think. It says faith is being sure of what we hope for, being convinced of what we do not see. See, God has chosen us for a reason, not of ourselves. He has granted all of humanity life because He's a giver. He wanted to give us life. And He has chosen us out of just the affection He has for us as the giver of life. And think about what He's done. Justice is part of who God is, and it's perfect justice. Now, that's a scary thing. Perfect justice is scary because it's absolute. There's no argument. I think about people who have rejected the Lord, and I think, I've seen the arguments. Well, you know, when I go before God, I don't believe in him. And if he is there, I'm going to say, how come you didn't give me more evidence? Or I'm going to say, how come you let all those children die? Or I'm going to say, how come you let the tsunami sweep away all those lives? How can you sit back with all this going on and you're expecting me to respect you? That's the way it's said. And I'm just going to say, you don't know what you're saying. His justice is absolute. You may think, or I may think that I've got a really good argument for God and that somehow he's going to be convinced. But if justice is absolute, it will not convince God because he already knows the answer to all of these questions in a way that none of us do. God has chosen to allow justice to pass over us. I was reading about these two guys that were hunting. And you know what broom sage is, right? Everybody knows what that is. That brown, feathery stuff that grows up to about this high, and it's brown year-round. I need to understand that because I don't know how that works. I mean, most plants go from green to brown seasonally, but broom sage just stays brown. It always looks the same. And I'll tell you something about broom sage. It burns real well. When it catches fire, it burns really well. And if it gets good and dry, it burns really, really well. How do I know that? Because I set some on fire one time accidentally, and it got out of hand so quick the fire department had to come put it out at my house. Well, these two hunters were in the middle of a field like that one across the street where it was nothing but broom sage. You know, out Swamp Road, there's one of those fields like that. If you've ever been out that way, there's a broom sage field that's as big as that farm field over there. It's broom sage right up to a tree line that's way off in the distance. Well, they were in the middle of it hunting birds, and they were crouched down in the broom sage, and you know, the birds fly over and you shoot them. I'm not a bird hunter. But all of a sudden, they smelled smoke. And one of them stood up and they saw that the broom sage was on fire. And they were crouched down, they didn't know it, and the fire's coming, and boy, you're not going to outrun it. So what did they do? He took a lighter out, good thing that one of them had one, and he lit the broom sage right where they were. You know, they mashed it down a little bit, so he lit it right where they were standing. And it burned a patch of the broom sage in front of them, and they went over and stepped over in that, and the fire passed over them. It never touched them because there was nothing there for where they were standing for it to burn. That's what God has done for you and me. Jesus' death on the cross has caused the fire of God's wrath to just pass over us without harming us. The justice was paid for. It had to be. And you and I can't do anything to increase or decrease God's love for us, even if we doubt. Even when all the props fail, and they will fail from time to time, to ask anybody who's laying in a hospital, who looks at their life and say, what's happened to me? All the props of their life have failed. Nothing's holding them up. They may even come to a place where they question that God cares about them. But God won't fail. He won't fail. I think about people who are forced at gunpoint or sword point or rope point or whatever they're forced at, to say you've got to choose now between saying, yes, I believe Jesus, or no, I don't. If you'll say no, I'll let you live. And that's happened. That's not something I'm making up. That happens and has happened. And I know that there are going to be times where people are going to come to that moment, and because of the weakness of their flesh, the weakness of who they are, they're going to say, I love my children too much to allow this to happen. And they lie. Now we look at that and we say, well, that's it. There are people who would say, that's it. God's going to abandon them to hell forever. No. He knows we're dust. As the songwriter says, our grip on your hand loosens. We can't hold on for long. But it's your hand holding our hand in a grip that's so sure and strong. Even when we're strangled by doubt, God will not fail. God will not fail. The salvation is secure. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything, you've got a question for me, you want to pray with me, I'll stay as long as it takes.